The ancient hangar groaned as the girl knelt beside the slumbering colossus, its golden metallic surface marred with eons of corrosion and neglect. Sparks cascaded around her, reflecting off the polished segments of the giant construct. Its massive body curled like a serpent, guarding a long-forgotten treasure, glowing faintly with embedded circular symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim lighting of the hangar. A dozen skeletal alien figures, tall and spindly, lurked in the background, their glossy insectoid eyes fixed on the girl with an eerie silence. Clad in a faded jumpsuit, her face smeared with grime and her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, Nova Lide adjusted the cables she was attaching to a primitive human-built power core. She bit her lip, muttering calculations under her breath while the creatures behind her exchanged incomprehensible whispers. Each movement carried the weight of desperation, as if her very life depended on this arcane ritual. The aliens mocked her efforts in their strange, chittering tongue. She didn't need to understand their language to know they thought her endeavor was futile. She was just a human, a species known more for its knack for destruction than its ingenuity, and yet she worked with the meticulousness of a watchmaker, ignoring their ridicule. She was no ordinary scavenger. She was here for something far greater than survival. This wasn't just a machine, it was the Eidolon. The story had begun 6 months ago when Nova stumbled across classified records hidden in the databanks of the crumbling Earth Coalition outpost on Foros 9. The Eidolon was a myth whispered in the shadows of ruined cities and abandoned stations, a war machine so advanced it was said to have turned the tide of the Orion Wars centuries ago. Stories claimed it was powered not by simple fuel or reactors, but by an artificial intelligence unlike anything humanity or the galaxy had ever seen. The Eidolon wasn't just a weapon, it was a legend. The Coalition had failed to keep it operational. Its power core, a miracle of pre-war engineering, had been deemed irreparable. The machine was mothballed, abandoned deep beneath the surface of Vionis Prime, a toxic wasteland considered uninhabitable after centuries of orbital bombardment. No one dared to go near it, no one but Nova. Her father's voice haunted her memories. Never trust the Coalition, Nova. They promise peace, but their hands are soaked in blood. He had been a rebel, a dissenter, and like so many others, executed for his defiance. She had spent her entire life running from their shadow, hiding among the stars. When she found the records of the Eidolon, something clicked. If she could bring it back to life, she could do more than survive. She could turn the galaxy upside down. The hangar was her battlefield now. The towering insect-like aliens watching her were an unanticipated complication. They called themselves the Zale, an enigmatic race that claimed dominion over the ruins of Vionis Prime. She had bargained her way into this hangar by promising to repair some of their failing atmospheric systems, though she doubted they cared much about air. Their mocking presence suggested they were simply indulging her. Human tinkering will achieve nothing, one of them clicked, its bony hand gesturing dismissively. The Eidolon belongs to the ashes of time. Yeah, well, I'm not a fan of giving up, Nova shot back without looking at them. Her hands moved swiftly, connecting cables, checking readouts. She wasn't here to debate. The Zyle could gawk all they wanted, but she was here to rewrite history. She had scavenged the power core from a Coalition wreck orbiting Vionis's smaller moon. It wasn't a perfect match, far from it, but she had spent weeks modifying it to sync with the Eidolon's dormant systems. Now, as she tightened the final coupling, her heart raced. The reactor hummed to life, a low, throbbing sound that resonated through the chamber. For a moment, the symbols etched into the Eidolon's frame flickered, then dimmed again. Nova cursed under her breath, grabbing a wrench and recalibrating the energy flux. The Zale exchanged looks. At least, she thought they did. Their eyeless faces were unreadable, but their body language suggested curiosity. "Why do you waste your short life on this relic?" another Zale rasped, stepping closer. Its voice was slow, deliberate, as if speaking to a child. "Even if you succeed, you cannot control it." Nova's hands paused for just a moment. "Who says I'm trying to control it?" The alien tilted its elongated head. "All creatures seek control. It is the root of conflict." "And maybe," Nova said, her voice rising, "this time, it's about ending it." The first time she saw the Eidolon up close, her breath had caught in her throat. The records hadn't done it justice. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a masterpiece of engineering that seemed almost alive. Every plate of its armor, every joint, every glowing node felt like it was part of a living organism. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a guardian, a sentinel that had been cast aside by those who didn't understand its purpose. And now, as she knelt before it, the realization hit her again. She wasn't just reactivating a machine, she was waking a god. The reactor surged, and this time the symbols glowed brighter, illuminating the hangar in pulsating light. The Xyle hissed, their wiry frames retreating slightly as the air grew heavy with static electricity. Nova's chest tightened as she stared at the readouts. The power levels were stabilizing, but barely. She needed more time. Suddenly, the ground trembled. At first, she thought it was a side effect of the activation, but the Xyle's alarmed chittering told her otherwise. One of them pointed toward the hangar's entrance, where distant thuds echoed closer. "Coalition forces," the Xyle hissed. "They have come for their relic." Nova's stomach dropped. She had known this was a possibility. The Coalition never left their secrets unguarded for long, and the power signature from the reactor would have been like a beacon, but she hadn't expected them so soon. "Stall them!" she barked at the Xyle, who only stared at her with their unblinking, alien gazes. "They will kill us all," one of them said. "Perhaps they will spare you." Nova glared at the alien, standing to face it. "They won't spare anyone. But if I get this thing running, we might have a chance." The Xyle hesitated, their chittering growing louder. Finally, one of them nodded, and they moved toward the entrance, their lanky forms disappearing into the shadows. Nova turned back to the Eidolon. Her hands shook as she adjusted the final parameters. She could hear the distant sounds of gunfire now, sharp cracks that echoed through the cavernous space. The Xyle wouldn't hold the Coalition off for long. She had minutes at best. The reactor roared, its vibrations rattling the floor. The symbols on the Eidolon's body flared, one by one, until the entire construct was bathed in golden light. Steam hissed from its joints as the massive form began to unfurl. Its head, shaped like a dragon's, lifted slowly, its glowing eyes flickering to life. Nova took a step back, her heart pounding. "Come on," she whispered. "Wake up." The Coalition soldiers stormed into the hangar, their black armor glinting under the Eidolon's light. They moved with military precision, their weapons trained on her. "Step away from the construct," one of them barked. "Now!" Nova raised her hands, her mind racing. The Eidolon's systems were still booting up. She needed more time. She glanced at the control panel, then at the soldiers, calculating her options. Before she could decide, the Eidolon moved. Its head snapped toward the soldiers, and a deep, resonant sound rumbled from its core, a sound that sent shivers down Nova's spine. The soldiers hesitated, their formation faltering as the massive machine straightened to its full height. It towered over them, its golden armor gleaming like the sun. One of the soldiers fired. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly off the Eidolon's chest. The machine tilted its head, almost as if studying them, before letting out a deafening roar. The sound was both mechanical and organic, a terrifying blend that shook the very walls of the hangar. Nova dropped to the ground as the Eidolon sprang to life. Its massive claws swept through the air, scattering the soldiers like insects. They fired wildly, their bullets bouncing off its armor. The machine moved with impossible grace, its every motion precise and deliberate. It wasn't just a weapon, it was an apex predator. Amid the chaos, Nova crawled toward the control panel. She needed to sync her interface with the Eidolon's systems. If she could establish a link, she might be able to direct its actions, or at least prevent it from going on a rampage. "Eidolon," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" The machine paused, its glowing eyes locking onto her. For a moment, everything went still. The soldiers, the Xyle, even the air seemed to freeze as the machine regarded her with an almost sentient curiosity. Nova's breath caught. "I'm not here to control you," she said. "I just need your help." The Eidolon's eyes flickered, and a low hum resonated through its frame. Nova couldn't tell if it was an acknowledgement or a warning. Either way, she knew one thing. The legend was awake, and the galaxy would never be the same. The hangar reeked of smoke and ozone, the acrid stench of gunfire mingling with the metallic tang of overheating machinery. Nova's knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of the control panel, her eyes locked on the towering Eidolon. It stood motionless for the briefest moment, as if the chaos around it was beneath its notice. The Coalition soldiers weren't so restrained. They regrouped quickly, barking orders and forming a firing line. "Suppressing fire!" one of them shouted. A barrage of plasma bolts erupted toward the Eidolon, each shot absorbed by the machine's golden armor, without so much as a scorch mark. The Eidolon tilted its head, almost as though amused, before its tail lashed out with a sickening crack, sending a reinforced supply crate hurtling into the squad. 3 soldiers went down instantly, their armor crumpling under the impact. The remaining forces scrambled for cover, their carefully planned assault devolving into panic. Nova barely had time to process the carnage. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body screaming aiming for rest, but her mind wouldn't let her stop. She scanned the interface on the control panel, desperate to establish a direct connection to the Eidolon's neural matrix. The ancient machine might have awakened, but she had no way of knowing how much of its systems were operational or how much it even understood about friend and foe. "Eidolon," she murmured, the words trembling from her lips. "If you're listening, we need to work together here." The Eidolon didn't respond, at least not in any conventional sense. Its massive head turned toward her briefly, the glowing symbols along its body pulsing in what she could only describe as curiosity. Then, with a thunderous roar, it charged the remaining soldiers. The coalition's leader, a stocky officer with a scar running down his cheek, activated a comm beacon on his wrist. "Bring in the suppressor drones, now!" Nova's stomach sank. Suppressors weren't standard issue. They were specialized countermeasures designed to neutralize high-value targets like rogue AIs or experimental machinery. She'd seen them in action once before during a raid on a rebel outpost. They didn't just disable machines, they annihilated them. A low hum filled the air as the suppressors entered the hangar, sleek and menacing with their black insectoid frames. Their appendages bristled with EMP projectors and adaptive plasma cannons. The Zale, who'd been lurking near the edges of the conflict, hissed in unison and began retreating further into the shadows. "Cowards," Nova muttered under her breath. Not that she blamed them. The Zale had probably seen enough death to last several lifetimes. They weren't going to risk their lives for her, or for the Eidolon. She grabbed a nearby toolkit, fumbling through it until she found a portable interface module. If she couldn't get a stable connection through the control panel, she'd have to try direct synchronization. It was a long shot, and potentially suicidal, but she was running out of options. Above her, the Eidolon let out another ground-shaking roar. One of the suppressor drones fired, a concentrated EMP pulse that rippled through the hangar like a silent thunderclap. The Eidolon stumbled, its glowing symbols flickering erratically. For the first time, Nova saw the great machine falter, its movements sluggish as the drones pressed their attack. "No, no, no," she muttered, clutching the interface module tightly. "You're not going down like this." She sprinted toward the Eidolon, weaving through the chaos as plasma bolts and EMP pulses streaked past her. A near miss seared the air inches from her face, and she ducked instinctively, her heart hammering in her chest. The drones seemed to register her movement but didn't fire. She was beneath their notice. A mere human wasn't worth the ammunition. Reaching the Eidolon's massive leg, Nova scaled the intricate latticework of its armor, her boots slipping on the smooth metal. The suppressors intensified their assault, and the Eidolon roared again, a sound that vibrated deep in her bones. She clung to the machine's side, her fingers searching for an access port among the glowing symbols. "Come on," she hissed, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Where are you?" Her hand found a recessed panel, and she yanked it open. The interior circuitry was a jumbled mess of ancient wiring and crystalline conduits, far beyond anything she had ever seen. She plugged in the interface module, praying it would be enough. The screen on her wrist lit up with a stream of incomprehensible data, symbols, patterns, and commands scrolled past faster than she could process. The Eidolon jerked violently, and Nova clung to it for dear life. "Eidolon," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I know you're not just a machine. I've seen the records. I know what you are." The data stream paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed. "They built you to end wars," she continued, "not to fight mindlessly, not to destroy everything in your path. If you let them win, they'll use you to do the very thing you were created to stop." Another pause. The symbols on the Eidolon's body flared brighter, their rhythm syncing with the pulses of the suppressor drone's attacks. Nova's screen flashed a single word in bold text: input. She hesitated, her mind racing. Input. What kind of input? Command codes, a directive, a memory surfaced, her father's voice, echoing from her childhood. Machines are only as dangerous as the intent behind them. You can't control them by force. You have to give them purpose. Purpose. That was it. "I'm not your master," she said, her voice barely audible over the din of the battle. "I'm not here to give you orders, but if you want a purpose, here it is. Protect the innocent. Stop the ones who would use you to hurt others." The screen blinked once, and then the data stream disappeared. For a terrifying moment, the Eidolon went completely still. Then, with a deafening clang, it swatted one of the suppressor drones out of the air. The remaining drones recalibrated, their weapons charging for another EMP barrage, but the Eidolon was faster. Its tail whipped around, slicing through two of the machines with surgical precision. The coalition forces fell back, their formation dissolving into chaos. The scarred officer barked into his comm, his voice tinged with desperation. "Deploy the orbital cannon. We're not leaving without that machine." Nova froze. Orbital cannon. They were going to level the entire hangar. The Zale, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward hesitantly. Their leader, a taller figure with a crest-like protrusion on its head, approached Nova. "This is your doing, human," it said, its voice laced with venom. "Your quest for power has brought destruction to us all." Nova glared at the alien. "You think I wanted this? If you'd helped me sooner, we could have stopped them before it came to this." The Zale leader hissed but said nothing. Instead, it raised one spindly arm and pointed toward a passageway at the back of the hangar. "There is a way out. Take your machine and leave this place." Nova looked at the Eidolon, which was dispatching the last of the suppressor drones with ruthless efficiency. The glowing symbols along its body pulsed steadily now, as if it had found its rhythm. "We can't just run," she said. "If they bring down that cannon, there won't be anything left of this planet." The Zale leader tilted its head. "And what do you propose, human? Sacrifice yourself for a machine?" Nova didn't answer immediately. Her mind raced, weighing her options. The Eidolon wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement, a living symbol of resistance. If she could turn it against the Coalition, she could change the balance of power in the galaxy. But first, she had to survive the next 10 minutes. "Eidolon," she called out, her voice firm. The massive machine turned to face her, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. "We need to move, now." The machine crouched low, allowing her to climb onto its back. The Zyle leader hissed something unintelligible, but Nova ignored it. She had made her choice. As the Eidolon carried her toward the passageway, the hangar shook violently. A beam of white-hot energy pierced the ceiling, carving through steel and concrete like butter. The orbital cannon had fired its first shot. "Faster!" Nova shouted, her hands gripping the Eidolon's armor. The machine surged forward, its powerful limbs propelling them through the narrow tunnel as debris rained down around them. Behind her, the hangar collapsed in a deafening roar, swallowing the Coalition forces and the Zale alike. Nova didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. For now, survival was enough. But as the Eidolon emerged into the toxic wasteland of Vionis Prime, its golden armor gleaming under the blood-red sky, Nova knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere, high above the planet, the Coalition was regrouping, and they weren't done with her yet. The wasteland stretched endlessly before Nova, a barren expanse of ash and jagged rock under a blood-red sky. The air shimmered with toxic heat, and distant geysers spewed streams of noxious vapor into the atmosphere. Riding on the back of the Eidolon, she could feel the machine's immense power thrumming beneath her. Its movements were fluid, almost feline, as it navigated the uneven terrain with ease. But every step carried a new weight in her chest. The hangar's collapse had been deafening, and the realization of what she'd left behind gnawed at her thoughts. The Zale. She hadn't meant to abandon them to the Coalition's orbital strike. Their leaders' hissed accusations echoed in her mind. "Your quest for power has brought destruction to us all." They were right, weren't they? She had brought this war to their doorstep. And for what? A machine. A gamble on a half-mythic weapon that might not even share her goals. She clenched her fists, the metallic chill of the Eidolon's armor biting into her skin. But before she could dwell further, a distant hum interrupted her thoughts. A sound growing steadily louder. She turned, squinting into the horizon. Her heart sank. Coalition pursuit craft, sleek and deadly, their engines glowing like blue embers against the dusky sky. They were closing in fast. Nova leaned forward, pressing her hands against the Eidolon's armor. "We've got company," she muttered. The machine's head turned slightly, as though acknowledging her words. Its glowing eyes flickered, scanning the incoming threat. Then it began to run. The sudden acceleration nearly threw Nova off its back. She gripped the edge of a spire-like protrusion. Her teeth gritted as the Eidolon leapt over jagged crevices and skidded down loose gravel slopes. The Coalition ships opened fire, their plasma cannons lighting up the sky. Streaks of blue energy scorched the ground around them, each near miss kicking up plumes of ash and debris. The Eidolon weaved and dodged with terrifying precision, its movements too agile for something of its size. Nova found herself marveling at its grace, even as her lungs burned from the toxic air. But the pursuers weren't giving up. One of the craft swooped low, its cannons spinning up for another volley. "Do something!" Nova shouted, her voice hoarse. "I don't think I can survive a direct hit." The Eidolon reacted instantly. Its tail whipped forward, and with a metallic thwang, it hurled a chunk of shattered rock at the incoming ship. The projectile struck the craft's left engine, sending it spiraling out of control. The ship exploded in a fiery burst, and Nova felt a grim satisfaction. One down, but there were two more, and they weren't making the same mistakes. As the pursuit continued, Nova's mind raced. She couldn't outrun them forever. The Eidolon was powerful, yes, but it it was still bound by its environment, and they weren't. She needed a plan, a way to turn the situation to her advantage. "Eidolon," she said, her voice trembling with urgency, "we need to find cover, something to force them to come to us." The machine didn't respond, at least not verbally, but it adjusted course, veering toward a series of jagged cliffs in the distance. Nova wasn't sure if it was following her suggestion or acting on its own, but either way she clung to its back as it raced toward the rocky outcrop. The cliffs loomed closer, their surfaces riddled with narrow caves and overhangs. The Eidolon darted into one of the larger crevices, its massive frame barely fitting. The coalition ships circled above, their searchlights scanning the ground. Nova slid off the Eidolon's back, her legs trembling as she stumbled into the shadows of the cave. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. "We've bought a little time. Now what?" The Eidolon crouched low, its glowing symbols dimming slightly as though conserving energy. Nova stared at it, her mind churning. This wasn't just about survival anymore. The coalition wouldn't stop until they had her, or destroyed her, and the Eidolon wasn't invincible. It could fight, sure, but it couldn't win a war on its own. Not without strategy, not without allies. But who could she trust? The Zael were gone, either dead or scattered. The rebel factions she'd grown up hearing about had been crushed years ago, and the coalition's iron grip on the galaxy meant most people would turn her in for a handful of credits. She was alone, wasn't she? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, like static, but layered with whispers. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness of the cave. The sound grew louder, and she realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the Eidolon. "Great," she muttered. "Now you're haunted." But the whispers weren't random. They had rhythm, a cadence that almost felt like words. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. The symbols on the Eidolon's body pulsed faintly, their glow synchronized with the sound. "Input," the machine's voice said, distorted and layered with static. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely mechanical either. The word sent a shiver down Nova's spine. "What do you mean, input?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I already told you what I want. Protect the innocent. Stop the coalition. What else do you need?" The whispers intensified, and for a brief moment, Nova thought she saw images flickering across the symbols, shapes and patterns that defied description. Her head ached just looking at them. Then she realized they weren't images, they were memories. Her breath caught in her throat. The Eidolon wasn't just alive, it was remembering. Flashes of battlefields, cities in flames, and faces she didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. A woman with piercing eyes, a soldier with a grim expression, a child clutching a stuffed toy. All of them gone in an instant, replaced by the sight of stars burning in a void. Nova staggered back, her mind reeling. What are you showing me?" The whispers faded, replaced by a single clear voice. "Purpose." Her knees buckled, and she sat heavily on the ground, staring at the machine. It wasn't just asking for direction, it was questioning her intent. Why was she doing this? For revenge? For redemption? For her father's memory? She didn't have an answer, and the weight of that realization crushed her. For years, she had told herself she was fighting for justice, for the people the coalition had trampled, but standing here, with the Eidolon's piercing gaze locked on her, she couldn't escape the truth. She wanted power. Power to make the galaxy listen, power to make them pay. Her hands curled into fists. "Is that what you wanted to hear?" she snapped, her voice cracking. "That I don't have some grand, noble reason? That I just want them to suffer like I've suffered?" The Eidolon didn't respond, but it didn't need to. The silence was enough. Nova buried her face in her hands, tears burning her eyes. She had spent so long running, fighting, trying to prove she was more than just some broken girl. And now, faced with the reality of her own motivations, she felt like a fraud. The sound of the coalition ships grew louder, their searchlights slicing through the cave's entrance. There wasn't time to wallow in self-pity. She had to act. "All right," she said, wiping her eyes. "You want a purpose? Here's one. Survive. Whatever it takes." The Eidolon symbols flared, their glow lighting up the cave like a beacon. The machine rose to its full height, its movements deliberate. Nova climbed back onto its back, her grip firm despite the tremor in her hands. As the first coalition craft descended into the canyon, the Eidolon leapt from the cave, its claws extended. Nova didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. But as the machine roared and the sky filled with fire, a single thought lingered in her mind. What happens when survival isn't enough? Above them, in orbit, the Coalition's command ship prepared for its final move. The countdown had begun, and Nova had no idea the scale of the storm heading her way. The Eidolon tore through the jagged landscape with mechanical precision, its movements impossibly smooth for something so massive. Nova clung to its back, every muscle in her body taut as the Coalition's pursuit ships closed in from above. The distant hum of their engines grew louder, more insistent, as the horizon erupted with bursts of plasma fire. Each streak lit the sky with an eerie blue glow, illuminating the wasteland's barren expanse. Nova's thoughts raced. The Coalition wasn't just trying to capture her anymore, they were trying to annihilate her. Above, the command ship lingered, its silhouette sharp against the crimson sky. Nova could feel it like a predator circling its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had seen its kind before, orbital weapons platforms masquerading as carriers, each one armed with enough firepower to turn a planet to dust. Somewhere aboard that monstrosity, someone was making the calculations to wipe her and the Eidolon off the map. The Eidolon suddenly skidded to a halt, its massive claws digging into the ground as it turned toward a jagged ravine ahead. Nova blinked, confused. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "We can't stop here." But the machine didn't respond. Instead, it crouched low, the glowing symbols along its body flickering erratically. For a brief moment, Nova thought it might be shutting down, but then she saw it, a series of faint markings etched into the rock face of the ravine. They were angular and alien, but unmistakably deliberate. The Zael, the markings formed a path, leading into the shadowy depths of the canyon. Nova's pulse quickened. The Zael had mentioned hidden passageways, though they'd been frustratingly vague about where they led. She had assumed they were exaggerating, but now, with the Coalition bearing down on her, she had little choice but to trust their cryptic warnings. "Fine," she muttered, gripping the Eidolon's armor. "Let's hope your instincts are better than mine." The machine leapt into the ravine, its massive frame moving with uncanny grace as it navigated the narrow, twisting path. The Coalition ships hesitated, their pilots clearly wary of following into such treacherous terrain. Nova allowed herself a brief, bitter smile. "They're not stupid," she thought, "just relentless." The ravine opened into a cavern, its walls shimmering with faint bioluminescent light. The air here was cooler, less toxic, and for a fleeting moment, Nova felt a strange sense of relief. The Eidolon slowed, its glowing eyes scanning the cavern as it moved deeper into the shadows. Nova slid off its back, her boots crunching against the gravel floor. She turned, her eyes darting toward the entrance. The Coalition ships hadn't followed, but she knew it wouldn't take them long to regroup. They were calculating, efficient, and once they figured out she had nowhere left to run, they'd strike with everything they had. "What now?" she whispered, more to herself than to the Eidolon. The machine didn't answer, but its gaze shifted toward a massive structure at the center of the cavern. It was ancient, clearly of Zael origin, its angular architecture illuminated by faint pulses of blue light. At its base was a console, its surface covered in the same intricate markings as the path outside. Nova's heart skipped a beat. The Eidolon moved toward the structure, its massive frame casting long shadows across the cavern. Nova hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious, but something about the structure felt significant, like it was waiting for her. She approached the console, her hands trembling as she brushed away the thin layer of dust covering its surface. The markings glowed brighter at her touch, their patterns shifting to form a coherent interface. She didn't understand the symbols, but her gut told her they weren't random. "What is this?" she muttered, glancing back at the Eidolon. The machine stood silently, its glowing eyes fixed on her. She placed her hand on the console, and the cavern erupted with light. The symbols spread across the walls, forming a vast, interconnected web of data. Images and sounds flooded her mind. Memories, battles, voices speaking in languages she couldn't understand. It was overwhelming, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. Then it stopped. The cavern fell silent and the console's glow dimmed. Nova staggered back, her breathing shallow, but in the silence she realized something. She understood. The Zael hadn't just hidden the Eidolon here, they had built it. The machine wasn't a relic of humanity's past. It was a hybrid creation, a synthesis of Zael and human ingenuity. The implications hit her like a freight train. The Coalition's obsession with the Eidolon wasn't just about its power. They knew. They had always known. This wasn't just a war machine, it was a bridge, a symbol of what could have been and what still might be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching engines. The Coalition wasn't waiting any longer. The cavern's entrance glowed with the light of plasma cannons charging, their beams slicing through the darkness. Nova's time had run out. She turned to the Eidolon, her mind racing. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "You wanted a purpose. Here it is. We're not running anymore." The machine tilted its head, the symbols along its body flaring brighter. later. For a moment, Nova felt as though it was waiting for something. Confirmation, perhaps, or permission. She nodded. Let's give them hell. The coalition's first volley tore through the cavern, shattering stalactites and sending chunks of rock crashing to the ground. The Eidolon roared, its voice shaking the very walls as it charged toward the enemy. Nova followed, her body moving on instinct as she dodged falling debris. The battle was chaos. The Eidolon moved like a predator, its claws tearing through the coalition forces with ruthless efficiency. But the command ship loomed above, its weapons charging for a final strike. Nova knew they couldn't win a straight fight. Not like this. Her eyes darted toward the console. The Xyle hadn't just built the Eidolon, they had built this cavern. And if the markings were any indication, the structure was more than a hiding place. It was a weapon. She sprinted back to the console, her fingers flying across its surface. The symbols shifted under her touch, forming a complex sequence of commands. She didn't know exactly what she was doing, but the patterns felt familiar, like a song she'd only half forgotten. Come on, she muttered. Work with me here. The console's glow intensified, and the cavern trembled. Above, the coalition's command ship fired, its beam slicing through the cavern's roof. But instead of destroying the structure, the energy was absorbed, redirected. The cavern's walls lit up, and the beam was refracted into 1,000 smaller rays, each one targeting the coalition forces. The command ship's engines flared as it tried to retreat, but it was too late. The beam struck with surgical precision, disabling its weapons and propulsion systems. The remaining ships scattered, their pilots abandoning the fight. Nova stepped back from the console, her chest heaving. The cavern fell silent once more, save for the faint hum of the Eidolon systems. She turned to the machine, a tired smile tugging at her lips. Well, she said, her voice laced with irony, I think that qualifies as hell. The Eidolon's eyes flickered, almost as though it was amused. Nova laughed, the sound raw and unsteady. For the first time, she felt something other than fear or anger. Relief. As the dust settled, she sat down against the console, her back pressed against the cool surface. The Eidolon crouched beside her, its massive frame strangely comforting. They had won, not just the battle, but something bigger. The cavern's lights dimmed, their glow soft and steady. Nova let her head fall back, staring up at the faintly glowing symbols above. For all her anger, all her doubt, she had found something here she hadn't expected. Clarity. The Eidolon turned its gaze toward her, its voice cutting through the silence. Input, Nova chuckled, shaking her head. You really need to work on your timing. The machine tilted its head, waiting. She sighed, her smile fading as she met its gaze. Let's rebuild. Not just this, all of it. The symbols along the Eidolon's body flared, their glow steady and bright. Nova didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Together, the cavern's lights dimmed further, leaving only the faint glow of the Eidolon's symbols as they prepared to step into the unknown. As soft silence fell over the cavern, broken only by the faint hum of the Eidolon's systems, Nova sat in the dim glow of the console, her chest still heaving from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. For the first time in what felt like years, there was no immediate danger, no gunfire, no pursuit, no orders barked over crackling comms. The coalition ships had scattered, their command ship crippled and drifting uselessly above the planet. She should have felt triumphant, but the weight in her chest wouldn't lift. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her, and turned to face the Eidolon, the machine's glowing eyes fixed on her as if waiting for her next move. Its form was still and silent now, the fury of its earlier movements replaced by an almost tranquil stillness. But Nova knew better. Beneath that serene exterior was power, power capable of reshaping the galaxy. What now? She muttered, her voice barely audible. The question wasn't directed at the Eidolon, it was for herself. The console behind her pulsed faintly, drawing her attention. She turned back to it, her fingers brushing against its surface. The patterns etched into the stone seemed to shift beneath her touch, forming a new sequence of symbols. At first, she thought it was another Xyle mechanism she didn't understand, but then she realized the truth. It was a message. The symbols resolved into an image, faint but unmistakable, a map of the galaxy, its star systems marked with glowing nodes. At its center was a single word, rendered in both human and Xyle script: unity. Nova stared at it, her heart pounding. The map wasn't just a record, it was a plan. The Xyle hadn't built the Eidolon as a weapon of war. They had built it as a keystone, a tool to bridge the divide between species, to forge alliances where none had existed before. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. Everything she had done, every choice she had made, had been leading to this moment. But was she ready for it? Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Machines are only as dangerous as the intent behind them. You can't control them by force. You have to give them purpose. She had spent so long fighting, against the coalition, against the galaxy, against herself, that she had forgotten what purpose even looked like. The console pulsed again, the map shifting to highlight a single star system on the edge of known space. Nova didn't recognize it, but the message was clear. The Eidolon wasn't done. Its creators had left it a final task, a destination that could shape the future of the galaxy, and it was asking her to guide it. She turned back to the Eidolon, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "Is this what you wanted? All this time, you were waiting for someone to finish what they started." The machine didn't respond, but its symbols glowed brighter, their rhythms steady and deliberate. Nova took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She had spent her whole life running from the coalition, from her past, from the weight of her father's legacy, but she wasn't running anymore. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Let's finish this." The Eidolon knelt, its massive frame lowering to allow her to climb aboard. Nova settled into the familiar groove between its spires, her hands gripping the edge of its armor. The console's glow faded as the machine rose, its movements smooth and purposeful. The map burned in her mind, its star systems etched into her memory. As the Eidolon carried her out of the cavern, the wasteland stretched out before them, bathed in the blood-red light of the setting sun. The coalition's ships were gone, but she knew they would return. This time, she would be ready, not with vengeance or anger, but with something far more powerful, a plan. Years later, the galaxy would tell the story of the girl and the machine. They would speak of how Nova lied, a scavenger from a broken world, turned a forgotten relic into a symbol of hope. They would speak of how the Eidolon, once a weapon of destruction, became the cornerstone of a fragile alliance that spanned species and worlds. And they would speak of the map, the path that led them to the edge of known space, where the Xyl's legacy awaited. But for Nova, the journey wasn't about glory or legend. It was about finding a place in a galaxy that had tried to break her. As the Eidolon carried her toward the unknown, she couldn't help but smile. A quiet, private smile that no one else would ever see. "Unity," she said, the word tasting strange but right on her tongue. "Guess there's a first time for everything." The machine's symbols pulsed once, a steady, reassuring rhythm, and as they disappeared into the horizon, the galaxy's first true alliance began, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a machine and the determination of a girl who refused to be forgotten. The story of Nova Lead and the Eidolon was complete, and it would never need another chapter.